This is an audio short story, No Matter What, by Jim Pope, read by Quack McMullard, Chapter 6.
No Matter What, Chapter 6. Today was the day of Paul's motorbike licence test, which involved a written exam as well as a practical test. The written part was actually a multiple choice questions on a computer, and it was very easy. But the practical test was a bit more tricky. It involved riding a bike around a course laid out with witches' hats. This had to be done without touching the ground with his feet. He needed good balance and just the right amount of speed. Too fast and he would not get around the turns, but too slow and he would lose balance. In the end he completed the course without faults and passed the test. So he was now able to ride a bike on the public road. Things were moving along quite well. Paul now had the finances to cover everything needed for the Great Escape, even though he still needed to convert the gold into cash. But that was well in hand. He now had a motorbike licence. Even though he didn't need a licence for the Great Escape, he did need to be able to ride a motorbike with some degree of skill. He was well along the road to getting his pilot's licence and mastering sailing, but there was still a lot to do. He needed to learn to fly a helicopter and to skydive. His first lesson in skydiving involved a bit of theory as well as rolling around on the floor, but it was the second lesson that scared the hell out of him. It involved him being strapped up close and personal with the instructor and then jumping out of a plane. It was scary for two reasons. He had no control over what was happening, as well as he was just a passenger. And also, there was the jumping out of a plane. He got through it without passing out or being sick, but he did look a bit pale once he got to the ground. After another lesson covering safety and what could only be called a dress rehearsal on the ground, it was time. The parachute was strapped on. All the checks were completed. The plainly slowed, climbing to 10,000 feet and lined up on the drop zone. The door was opened. The instructor tapped him on the shoulder and then gestated with a wave of his hand, and even though he could not hear him, he said, "Go." With that, Paul jumped out of the plane. A few seconds later, he pulled the cord that released the parachute. He went from falling at a great rate of knots to floating gently down. He pulled on the ropes as instructed to steer in the intended direction. His first attempt steered in the wrong direction, but he soon worked it out and the ground was coming up on him fast. He pulled on the ropes to slow the fall and made a perfect landing, not all that far from the landing circle. Over the next few weeks, Paul continued skydiving until he felt he had it mastered enough for his needs. The lawyers working on Janet's appeal contacted Paul with the news that the date for her case had been set for a little over 2 months away. This was not good news. He was well down the track with learning the skills needed, but there was still a great deal to do. He might need to make some shortcuts. He signed up for the helicopter lessons, which meant learning to fly a light plane and a helicopter in parallel. On hearing the news that the appeal was just 2 months away, Janet felt relieved that there was an end date for the hell she was living in. But she also knew what that meant. Calling it an end date was an apt way to refer to it. It would mean the end. Paul spent as much time as he could at the garage melting down gold into small nuggets and flakes. He would have to sell the gold in larger amounts over a shorter period than he originally planned, which could draw attention to him. He decided to sell it to gold merchants in different cities to minimise the risk. So over the next few weeks, in between his flying lessons, he drove to Melbourne and Brisbane. He did not sell any in Sydney, as this would be too much of a risk. Paul was feeling the time pressure, even though he had a little under 2 months to the appeal. But the Great Escape would need to happen before the appeal, as Janet's prison situation may change during and after the appeal. Paul still had problems that he had not worked out a solution to, like how he would get 2 cars to somewhere near Wallet's Inlet in Western Australia and make sure they were not found during the time they were there. Then there was the bigger problem of how he would get a yacht to an uninhabited island in the Indian Ocean. Sure, he could sail it there, but how would he get back? The plane did not present any problems, as he would just fly it there under one of his false names, and the motorbike could be purchased locally. He hoped to rent a helicopter locally as well, but he had not checked on that yet. The internet became Paul's best friend as he spent hours in the garage trolling the internet, trying to come up with solutions. With all this activity, Paul had not had time to contact Lizzie. He thought about ringing her, but before he could, he had a visit from Detective Sergeant Elizabeth Bennett and Detective Constable George Blake. It was so nice to see her, but he didn't need police attention at the moment. He had too much else to deal with. He invited them in and offered them tea, but as usual, Lizzie was all business. "I would just like to ask you a few questions," said Lizzie, while George just stood there and observed. "Yes, of course, anything for you, Lizzie," replied Paul. He then added, "Sorry I have not been in contact for a few weeks. Things are getting a bit hectic." Lizzie just stood there, seemingly without any questions, when George said, "There has been a burglary of a large amount of gold. Did you have anything to do with that?" "No," replied Paul, and then went on, "I'm just a harmless public servant on long service leave. Stealing gold is not in my skill set." This brought a wry smile to Lizzie's face. It was obvious that George thought he was not involved and was puzzled on why his boss did. Lizzie, on the other hand, believed Paul was the burglar, but she had no evidence. Lizzie realised that her being there was serving no purpose, so she said, "Thanks for your cooperation," and started to walk out. Paul followed them to the door and said, Sorry. Lizzie went back to the police station, and both her and George spent hours watching the nearest CCTV footage from the streets near the last burglary. After hours of video, Lizzie came across some footage of a police officer pulling someone over only a few kilometres from the crime scene. She had George contact the officer for the details, but it led nowhere. After much research and thought, Paul had finally worked out answers to his problems. He would fly to Darwin and buy, using one of his fake names, a large 4-wheel drive and a car trailer. He would then buy and trailer 2 smaller 4-wheel drives to Wallet's Inlet in Western Australia and hide them in the bush. This would take 2 trips. He would then drive the large 4-wheel drive and empty car trailer back to Darwin, sell them and fly back to Sydney. According to Google Maps, the only suitable location was a bit further up the river than he would like, but he had no other option. The yacht would not be able to get that far up the river, so Paul and Janet would have to get there using an inflatable raft. There was no roads to this location, so we'd have to drive the last few kilometres across country. Getting the yacht to a small uninhabited island 20 kilometres off the coast of this horrible country presented Paul with a number of problems. He decided that this would be the last thing he would do before the Great Escape. Because of the time problem, he would need to buy the yacht in Darwin, as the sailing time from the east coast of Australia was too long. But Darwin was not a big place, and there may not be too many yachts for sale. A quick check on the internet revealed only 2, but both looked and sounded suitable. He would also need to purchase a powered inflatable dinghy, small enough to be mounted on the deck of the yacht, but big enough to cover the 20 kilometres trip from Gore Island to the coast. He would sail from Darwin to the island, hide the yacht the best he could, using camouflage nets, then using the inflatable, travel to the coast. He planned to land on the coast in a quiet location, hide the inflatable, and then make his way to the capital city. The plan was in place, but the big problem was time. He only had 4 weeks to get his plane and helicopter licenses, as well as sell the rest of the gold. The license to fly a light plane would not be a problem, but the helicopter licence would be. So he increased the amount of lessons to 4 per week. He decided to sell the last of the gold to a Sydney gold merchant just before flying out to start the Great Escape. If he did draw any suspicion, he would be gone before it could be acted on. He started to feel at peace with it all. He thought the plan was doable. The time frame was tight but could be done. The whole endeavour could go wrong at any point and may result in him being arrested in Australia or parts foreign. Or even worse, he could be killed in so many ways, as could Janet. But it was a dead cert for Janet if he did nothing. Even though he felt at peace with the plan and the Great Escape, he still found himself craving some company and some time away from thinking about it. Some time when he would not have to think or worry. So he rang Lizzie. The phone rang out and went to an answer machine, so Paul left a message. "Hi Lizzie. Sorry that it's been a while. Things have been a bit hectic. How about dinner tonight, the Chicken House, 7 o'clock? You know you want to." Paul arrived at the Chicken House at 6:30. As it was a weeknight, it was not particularly busy, so he managed to get the same table from last time. He told the waiter that he was waiting for someone, and he sat there, looking out over the river. His brain was still thinking at 100 miles per hour about the plan and all that it encompassed. He didn't notice the time pass as he sat there in a trance, when a voice said, "Hi." It was Lizzie. Lizzie was wearing the same long red dress from the first time, and she looked like a dream come true. Paul was lost for words at first, as he was not really expecting her to come. After composing himself, he said, "Hi Lizzie, you're looking good tonight. Have a seat." Lizzie sat down at the table and said, "What have you been up to lately?" "Nothing much of interest. Have you caught your burglar yet?" Paul replied. "Let's not talk about shop tonight," said Lizzie. "That's a good idea, Lizzie," Paul replied. "How are things with your sister?" said Lizzie. "Let's not talk about that tonight," replied Paul. There was an awkward silence before the waiter came over and asked if they were ready to order. Lizzie said 2 chicken dinners and 2 orange juices, and looked at Paul. Paul just smiled with approval as the waiter walked away. "Have you had that Ford Escort out for a late night drive lately?" asked Lizzie. "No," replied Paul, and then added, "I've been sleeping well, so there was no need. I haven't driven it for some time." He then paused before saying, "Had great hopes of going to a big car event in Queensland, but that will have to wait till next year. What about you, Lizzie? Have you found something other than work to live for?" "No, She paused. "What makes you think I need something?" said Lizzie. Paul smiled and said, "Well, it's like you have a invisible sign around your neck saying, 'I'm lost.' You need to do something about that. Take a chance. Make a radical change. And anyway, you being here says it all." "So what? You're what I need," said Lizzie in a somewhat irritated voice. "No. Did you have a dream when you were a little girl? Something you wanted from life? And don't tell me it's what you're currently doing," asked Paul. The waiter arrived with their meals and drinks. Once the waiter had gone, Lizzie looked at Paul and said, "Don't laugh," waving her finger at him. "I always wanted to live out in the bush, grow my own food, keep a few animals, and just be in harmony with nature." "Why don't you then?" replied Paul. "It would not be the sensible thing to do," said Lizzie. "Never, never use that word around me again," replied Paul. "What word?" said Lizzie. "You want me to say it?" Paul paused before saying, "Sensible." They both smiled. Then Paul said, "Thanks for coming tonight. You have brightened up my day no end." "Did it need brightening up?" said Lizzie. "Just a bit," replied Paul. After finishing their meals, they sat there looking out over the river, but time was ticking by and Paul had a big day coming up. "Thanks for a great night, Lizzie," Paul said, and then, "I would love to do this again soonish." Lizzie looked a bit puzzled as it was still early, but said, "Yeah, that would be nice." They both walked to reception to pay the bill. Lizzie was determined to pay her share this time. Paul let her, but told her not to be so money obsessed, and that they would have this conversation on another day. They walked to Lizzie's car and opened the door. "Well," she said, "thanks for a nice night." Paul said nothing. He just took her hand and looked into her eyes for a few moments before kissing her. "Good night, Lizzie," Paul said as he walked away.
Copyright 2022. To listen to or read more chapters, go to www.yellowduckmotorsport.com. Click on Books, drop-down menu, then click on No Matter What. To listen to more chapters or to read, click on Chapters.